The heavy oak gavel didn't just strike the block. It shattered the silence of the courtroom like a 12-gauge shotgun blast echoing in an empty canyon. The sharp, clean crack reverberated off the high, dark, mahogany-paneled walls of the Cook County District Court, freezing the breath of everyone in the gallery. "Order! I will have order in my court!" Judge Harlan Vance roared, though no one was making a sound. He leaned his massive frame forward over the bench, his black robe straining across broad, heavy shoulders. His face permanently flushed a deep, angry crimson, twisted into a sneer of pure, unadulterated contempt, a look he didn't even bother to hide from the public. He looked less like a public servant and more like a bulldog guarding the gates of a private fiefdom. Sitting in the squeaking cold metal defendant's chair was a man who looked entirely defeated. His name, according to the state's docket, was Marcus Vance. He was wearing a cheap, ill-fitting charcoal suit that looked like it had been pulled from a clearance rack at a thrift store. His shoulders slumped, his head bowed low toward the scarred wooden defense table. To the packed gallery sitting behind the wooden railing, he looked like a tragic, predictable statistic. A black man in his late 30s with no money, no powerful connections, no expensive legal team, and absolutely no hope. He was just another face swallowed up by the relentless, grinding jaws of the criminal justice system. But to Judge Harlan Vance and the predatory prosecutor standing just a few feet away, Marcus wasn't a human being. He was prey. He was a stepping stone, a minor inconvenience easily crushed beneath the boot of institutional power. What neither the arrogant judge nor the smug, meticulously groomed prosecutor knew was that the man sitting there in heavy ankle shackles wasn't some helpless, desperate mechanic picked up from the rough concrete streets of Chicago's South Side. He wasn't a statistic. He was Special Agent Marcus Vance of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, working deep cover with the Public Corruption Unit. And he hadn't been caught. He hadn't made a mistake. He wasn't there to be judged by a corrupt system. He was there to drop the hammer. The air inside room 402 felt thick, stale, and suffocatingly heavy. It carried the distinct, oppressive smell of old floor wax, burnt convenience store coffee, and the invisible, sour stench of human fear. State Prosecutor Edward Langford paced back and forth in front of the jury box with a slow, rhythmic arrogance, moving like a man who owned the building, the law, and the souls of everyone inside it. His silk tie gleamed under the harsh fluorescent lights, his hair perfectly styled with pomade, not a single strand out of place. Langford stopped his pacing abruptly. He turned slowly on the heel of his Italian leather shoes, paused for dramatic effect, and raised a manicured long finger, pointing it straight at Marcus's face. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Langford began, his voice dropping into a low, theatrical cadence, dripping with manufactured sorrow and fake empathy. "We live in a fragile society, a society held together by a thin, sacred ribbon of laws. Without them, we are nothing more than animals tearing at each other in the dark. And what we have sitting before us today is a blatant, calculated, and malicious disregard for those very laws." He waved his hand dismissively toward Marcus, a gesture of pure disgust. The defendant didn't just break into a local veteran-owned auto repair shop in the dead of night to steal high-end diagnostic equipment and parts. No, it gets worse. When a brave, dedicated officer of the law confronted him, this man chose violence. He chose to strike down a protector of our community. Marcus sat perfectly, unnaturally still. His eyes remained fixed on a deep scratch in the varnish of the defense table, his expression a mask of vacant compliance. Underneath that cheap polyester jacket, however, his pulse was a steady, rhythmic 60 beats a minute. He was a trained operator. He knew how to control his biology. To the wolves in the room, he had to look broken. He had to look terrified. A man drowning in the reality of a 20-year sentence. But every single word echoing through the high ceilings of that courtroom, every mocking laugh, every biased statement, was being captured in high-definition audio by a military-grade microphone sewn into the frayed thread of his collar. The signal was beaming directly to a plain white surveillance van parked 3 blocks away, where a team of federal technicians sat with headphones on, recording the death knell of a criminal empire. Judge Harlan Vance was known across the state as the hangman of the ward. If you were poor, if you were a minority, or if you happened to stand in the way of the political machinery that funded his re-election campaigns, stepping into his courtroom wasn't a trial. It was an administrative execution. He had spent 15 years building a reputation as a no-nonsense, tough-on-crime conservative. But behind the closed doors of his chambers, he was the kingpin of a massive civil asset forfeiture ring. "I saw you rolling your eyes, boy," Judge Vance suddenly rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. The entire courtroom went dead silent. The gallery held its breath. The young public defender assigned to Marcus's case, a brilliant but overwhelmed woman named Brooke Lawson, shot to her feet like a spring. Her hands were trembling, but her eyes were fierce with a righteous anger that the system hadn't been able to burn out of her yet. "Objection, Your Honor," Brooke shouted, her voice cutting through the thick air. "My client did no such thing. Furthermore, the court's use of the term boy is overtly prejudicial, derogatory, and highly improper." Judge Vance didn't even bother to look at her. He didn't turn his head an inch. He just leaned slightly closer to his microphone. "Overruled. Sit down, Ms. Lawson, before I find you in summary contempt of court and have the bailiff escort you to a holding cell." He kept his cold, dead eyes locked squarely on Marcus. "I know disrespect when I see it. I see it in the way you hold yourself. I see it in your history." Marcus swallowed hard, forcing his chin to drop lower, the picture of a subdued, terrified target. Record it all, he thought to himself, watching the digital timestamp in his mind. Keep talking, old man. Let every ugly, biased, corrupt word fill up the transcript. The FBI operation had been meticulously constructed over 8 grueling months for this exact moment. Anonymous tips, desperate letters from prison, and terrified whistleblowers had been pouring into the Chicago field office for nearly a year. The stories were always identical. Ordinary citizens, often business owners or homeowners in rapidly gentrifying areas, vanishing into the state penitentiary system on fabricated or heavily exaggerated charges. While they were locked away, their properties, their bank accounts, and their life savings were seized under the state's loose civil asset forfeiture laws. The assets were auctioned off for pennies, always ending up in the hands of anonymous shell companies registered in Delaware. The common bloody thread in every single case was Judge Harlan Vance and prosecutor Edward Langford. They were brilliant, careful monsters. They never left a paper trail, never took a direct bribe, and always wrapped their theft in the neat, clean flag of judicial procedure. So, the Bureau decided to give them the perfect victim, someone they would never look twice at, someone their arrogance would blind them to. "The state calls Officer Kyle Donovan to the stand," Langford announced, his voice echoing with confidence. A thick-necked, buzz-cut patrol officer swaggered through the swinging wooden gates. His uniform was stretched tight across a barrel chest, his leather duty belt creaking with the weight of his firearm and handcuffs. He walked up to the witness stand with the casual indifference of a man who owned the room, resting a heavy hand on the Bible and swearing the oath while his jaw chewed rhythmically on a piece of wintergreen gum. Donovan adjusted the microphone, leaning in close. I was on routine patrol in the South Side sector. I observed the suspect, Mr. Vance, prying open the secure back door of the auto shop with a heavy iron tool. When I exited my vehicle and gave loud, clear commands to halt, the suspect turned and swung a heavy tire iron directly at my head. I feared for my life, Your Honor. I was forced to use necessary defensive force to subdue the suspect and protect the public. A collective theatrical gasp swept through the hand-picked gallery members. It was a flawless piece of performance art. It was also a complete, unadulterated lie. Marcus remembered the actual night with terrifying clarity. He had been intentionally staging a vehicle breakdown on the shoulder of a dark road near the target property. Officer Donovan had pulled up, his cruiser's headlights cutting through the dark. The very first thing Donovan did after stepping out of his vehicle was reach up and click off his body-worn camera. Without a single word of warning, he had pulled his heavy tactical flashlight and pistol-whipped Marcus across the temple, knocking him into the dirt before opening Marcus's trunk and planting 3 stolen catalytic converters and a crowbar inside. Brooke Lawson tried to fight. She fought like a lioness trapped in a cage. She objected to every blatant lie, every piece of unsubstantiated hearsay, and every racist, subtle nudge that came from the bench. But it was useless. Judge Vance overruled her time and time again, his gavel falling like a rhythmic executioner's axe. He would lean over the bench, looking at the mostly white suburban jury with a conspiratorial, folksy wink. We all know how these situations develop in the heat of the moment in those neighborhoods, don't we, ladies and gentlemen? The judge said smoothly, his tone warm and familiar. By the time the court called for the afternoon recess, the narrative was concrete, heavy, and unyielding. Marcus Vance was a violent, uneducated, dangerous career criminal who hated authority and preyed on honest business owners. In the cramped concrete holding cell behind the courtroom, the air was freezing and smelled of industrial bleach. Brooke Lawson paced the floor, her heels clicking loudly against the dirty tile, her fingers running frantically through her hair in a state of utter panic. "They just threw a plea deal at us," she whispered, her voice cracking as she leaned against the rusted iron bars, looking at Marcus. "Langford just offered 5 years in maximum security, with a possibility of parole in 3. Marcus looked up, the vacant, broken look completely gone from his eyes. His gaze was suddenly sharp, piercing, and terrifyingly cold. "I didn't do it, Brooke." "I know you didn't," she said fiercely, tears of frustration welling in her eyes. "I know the police report is a fabrication, but Judge Vance blocked my motion to introduce your phone's GPS data. He blocked the timeline analysis. He's suppressing every single piece of exculpatory evidence we have. Marcus, listen to me. Neuan tu choi giao keo nai vara tua trantung jen kung, ong ta se fatan muchian toi jala he muay nam tu. Vate hon nua, hosengai lapto kich hoa gio koantik tutai sandan su joy voi kan hakua banoyan. Kan hanam gai gok juong quan trong o kunam. They don't want you, Marcus. They want that land for the multi-million-dollar commercial bypass project the city council just quietly approved. They are clearing the block." Marcus stood up slowly. As he rose, the nervous slouch, the defeated posture, and the aura of a helpless victim vanished into thin air. He stood tall, his posture commanding, his shoulders broad. When he spoke, his voice didn't sound like an uneducated street mechanic. It was a deep, calm, and authoritative baritone that filled the small concrete room. "No deal," Marcus said, his voice carrying the weight of iron. "Go back into that courtroom and fight exactly the way you've been fighting. Object to every single sentence out of Langford's mouth. Make them document every single lie." Brooke blinked, taking a step back, her mouth slightly open. For the first time, she saw the cold, unyielding steel beneath the desperate act. She realized she wasn't looking at a victim. She was looking at a soldier. Okay, I will." When the court reconvened 20 minutes later, the atmosphere in the room had shifted. The air felt hotter, uglier, more oppressive. Judge Vance looked thoroughly bored, leaning back in his leather chair, checking his gold watch. Langford stood at the prosecution table, licking his lips like a wolf that had already cornered its meal, ready to completely dismantle the defense's final stand. Marcus took the witness stand. He spoke clearly, his tone measured and calm. He told the simple, unvarnished truth. He had been changing a flat tire after a late-night job interview, his hands flat on the hood of his car the entire time. There was no tire iron swung. There were no threats made to an officer. Langford immediately invaded his space, stepping up to the witness stand until he was mere inches from Marcus's face, his expensive cologne filling the air, a sneer plastered on his face. "You're unemployed, aren't you, Mr. Vance?" Langford scoffed, his voice dripping with condescension. "Living off cash jobs? Is that what we're calling fencing stolen auto parts these days? Cash jobs?" He snatched up a piece of paper from his desk, waving it dramatically toward the jury. "A juvenile record from 20 years ago for shoplifting a candy bar. A clear, undeniable, lifelong pattern of criminal behavior." "Objection! Relevance!" Brooke shouted, standing up. "Overruled!" Judge Vance barked, slamming his gavel down with a violent crack. He glared at Marcus, his face turning an unhealthily dark shade of purple. "Answer the prosecutor's question, boy." Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't look down. He leaned forward, locking his eyes directly onto the judge's angry gaze, his voice incredibly calm, incredibly steady. "I think the world owes us the truth, Your Honor." The judge's face contorted with absolute rage. The sheer arrogance of a poor black man looking him in the eye and talking about truth broke his professional facade entirely. He leaned forward, his microphone screeching with feedback. "You watch your mouth in my court," Vance bellowed, his voice echoing off the walls. "People like you are a cancer on this city. Thugs, leeches. You think you can walk into our communities, take what you want, and look at me like you're an equal? Your kind belongs behind bars, and I am going to make sure you stay there." The mask was completely gone. The quiet, systemic ugliness that usually hid behind legalese and pleasant smiles was now shouting at the top of its lungs into a recorded microphone. The courtroom was stunned into a horrified silence. Closing arguments were nothing more than a formality. The jury, completely manipulated and stripped of any actual facts, deliberated for barely 40 minutes before returning to the box. They walked in with their heads down, refusing to look at Marcus. "On the count of grand larceny, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of aggravated assault on a law enforcement officer, we find the defendant guilty." Judge Vance grinned, a wide, predatory, wolf-like smile that bared his teeth. He didn't even bother to schedule a sentencing hearing, skipping the entire statutory process. 20 years in the state penitentiary, maximum security, Judge Vance announced with malicious delight. And under the provisions of civil asset forfeiture, the real estate asset located on the South Side corridor is hereby seized by the state, effective immediately. He snapped his fingers at the large, heavily muscled court bailiff standing near the wall. "Bailiff, take this garbage out of my sight." The burly bailiff stepped forward, reaching out a rough hand to grab Marcus roughly by the upper arm. "Don't touch me." The words didn't come out as a plea. They didn't come out as an angry shout. They came out as a freezing, authoritative command, a voice of absolute power that froze the bailiff dead in his tracks. It was a voice that belonged to a man who commanded legions, completely unlike the scared, broken mechanic they had spent all day mocking. Judge Vance let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Add resisting arrest to his chart, Langford." Marcus raised his voice slightly, ensuring it carried to every single corner of the room, crisp and undeniable. "I said, do not touch me." With a smooth, lightning-fast motion that didn't match the heavy chains around his ankles, Marcus reached deep into the inner lining of his cheap polyester jacket. "He's got a gun," Langford shrieked, his polished professionalism vanishing instantly as he dove headfirst under the prosecution table, screaming like a terrified child. The bailiff's hand flew to the security snap of his holster, his face pale. "FBI!" Marcus shouted, his arm whipping out of his jacket. But he didn't pull a weapon. He held a heavy, gleaming gold badge, the Federal Eagle catching the light, alongside an official laminated identification card. "Special Agent Marcus Vance, Federal Bureau of Investigation. Nobody moves an inch." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. You could hear the faint hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Judge Harlan Vance froze mid-air, his gavel hovering 3 inches above the wooden block, the blood draining from his heavy cheeks until his face went from a furious purple to a sick, chalky white. His jaw dropped slightly, his eyes wide and trembling as they locked onto the gold badge. What is the meaning of this?" the judge stammered, his voice suddenly small, weak, and frail. "This is a state court. You have no authority here." At that exact millisecond, the heavy double oak doors at the back of the courtroom didn't just open. They exploded inward, slamming against the drywall with a deafening crash. "FBI, nobody move! Hands where I can see them!" A tactical entry team clad in heavy black body armor, ballistic helmets, and dark blue windbreakers with FBI emblazoned in stark white letters poured into the room like an unstoppable wave, their tactical rifles raised. They took corners, secured the perimeter, and locked down every exit within 5 seconds. Behind the tactical shield strode Assistant FBI Director Elena Harper. She was a legendary figure in the Bureau, a woman with sharp steel gray hair cut into a precise bob, and eyes like cold tactical knives that cut through anyone she looked at. "Secure the bench, secure the prosecutor," Director Harper ordered, her voice booming through the room with unquestioned authority. "Nobody leaves this room. Collect all cell phones and recording equipment." Marcus Vance stood tall, his chains clinking musically against the floorboards as he walked calmly, deliberately, straight up the steps of the judicial dais. He walked right up to the judge's desk, leaning over it, looking the terrified, sweating old man dead in his eyes. "Harlan Vance," Marcus said, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. "You are under arrest for federal racketeering, wire fraud, conspiracy to violate civil rights under color of law, and institutional judicial corruption." Marcus reached into his pocket, pulled out a small tactical key, and smoothly unlocked his own handcuffs and ankle shackles, letting the heavy steel clatter loudly to the floorboards. He looked down at the chains, then back up at the judge. "Your court is officially adjourned, permanently." Absolute chaos erupted in the gallery, but the federal agents had the room under total control. Officer Kyle Donovan, the lying patrolman, watched 3 tactical lasers paint his chest. His hands trembled as he slowly unbuckled his duty belt and let his firearm hit the floor with a heavy thud. Judge Vance was pulled roughly out from behind his massive mahogany bench, his black robe tearing slightly as his hands were forced behind his back and clamped into heavy steel federal cuffs. He was screaming, his voice cracking with desperation, spit flying from his lips. "You can't do this to me. I am the law in this county. I am the law." Meanwhile, Prosecutor Edward Langford was dragged out from underneath the defense table, crying openly, his expensive silk tie stained with floor dust. He was trembling, his polished arrogance completely shattered into dust. I'll talk. Don't shoot. I have files. I have ledgers. I'll give you everyone else. Just please don't put me in federal." Marcus turned away from the pathetic display and walked over to the jury box, looking at the 12 men and women who sat there, frozen in sheer terror. "You weren't wrong in your verdict," Marcus told them gently, his voice warm and reassuring. "You were lied to by the people you were taught to trust. Every piece of evidence presented to you was a fabrication. Every word of testimony from that stand was perjury. You weren't serving justice today. You were being used as a weapon to commit a robbery." He turned and walked over to the defense table, where Brooke Lawson was still standing, completely frozen, her hands still clutching her legal notepad, her mind trying to process the fact that her penniless client was actually a high-ranking federal operative. Marcus smiled, a genuine warm smile, and extended his hand. "You fought for me in there like I was your own flesh and blood, counselor. You didn't back down, even when the whole world was rigged against us. Thank you. The justice system needs 1,000 more of you." 2 hours later, the courtroom had been completely transformed into a federal command post. Technicians were downloading data from the building's mainframes, while field agents packed evidence into heavy plastic crates. The true scope of the rot was finally spilling out into the light. It wasn't just about small-time bribes or fixing traffic tickets. It was a massive, multi-million-dollar corporate conspiracy. The commercial bypass project wasn't a public utility. It was a land-grab scheme designed by a syndicate of billionaires and corrupt politicians. The plan was to clear out entire historic working-class neighborhoods, block by block, using the courts to falsely convict property owners, seize their land under civil forfeiture, and flip it to developers for a massive, untaxable profit. The racism, the prejudice, the bias, it wasn't just a personal flaw of Judge Vance. It was their primary operational tool. They knew that nobody in the media or the state capitol would question it when poor minority men from the South Side vanished into the prison system. It was easy. It was quiet. It was profitable. But the federal agents had found the Holy Grail. Inside a hidden, fireproof safe behind a painting in Judge Vance's private chambers, they pulled out a thick, black leather ledger. It contained names, dates, offshore bank routing numbers, and a meticulous record of every bribe taken, every framed defendant, and every stolen home. The rot went all the way to the top. Within an hour of sitting in a cold federal holding cell, the broken judge began naming names to save himself from spending the rest of his natural life in a supermax facility. He gave up State Senator Reginald Thorne, the powerful politician who had personally engineered the zoning laws to facilitate the theft. He gave up Police Chief Victor Kane, who had actively covered up the suspicious, accidental death of an investigative journalist months prior. And he gave up Elliot Vaughn, the billionaire real estate developer who bought the stolen land for pennies. A few days later, on a bright, beautiful afternoon, Marcus Vance stood on the wide granite steps outside the Cook County Courthouse, leaning against his unmarked sedan, watching the world change. The heavy iron doors of the facility opened, and a crowd of men and women stepped out into the warm sunlight. These were the wrongfully convicted victims of Judge Vance's court, their records cleared, their convictions vacated by a federal judge. They were weeping, hugging their mothers, their wives, and holding children they hadn't seen in years. The civil forfeiture orders had been reversed. Families were getting their homes back, and the corrupt bypass project was completely dead. Brooke Lawson walked down the steps, standing beside Marcus. She was wearing a sharp, dark navy suit, her posture straight, her eyes radiating the quiet, unbreakable confidence of someone who had just fundamentally changed the future of a city. She had just been appointed as the interim special prosecutor to oversee the largest civil rights class action lawsuit in the state's history. "You did that, Marcus," she said softly, watching a young father lift his daughter into the air. Marcus turned his head, looking at her with a gentle smile. "We did that, counselor." He opened the driver's side door of his car, the engine purring to life. "There are a lot more Judge Vances out there, Brooke," Marcus said quietly, his eyes turning serious as he looked out over the skyline. "A lot more small towns and big cities where a badge and a robe are just viewed as a corporate license to steal from the vulnerable." Brooke nodded her head, her jaw setting with determination. "Then you better keep driving, Agent Vance, and we'll be right here waiting to finish them off in the papers." Marcus slid into the driver's seat, rolling down the window one last time. "Keep fighting the good fight, counselor." He pulled away from the curb, watching the grand stone courthouse shrink into his rearview mirror, watching families laugh and cry tears of joy in the sweet afternoon sun. The file on Cook County was officially closed, but the real work never truly ends. And that is the story of how one undercover agent and one fiercely determined lawyer brought down an empire built entirely on greed, racism, and stolen lives. It's a stark, powerful reminder that sometimes the very people who swear a sacred oath to protect the law are the ones breaking it the worst. But no matter how deep the shadows get, the truth always finds a way out into the light. Judge Vance thought his black robe made him an untouchable god. Senator Thorne thought his political title made him a king. But they both forgot the most ancient, dangerous rule of the jungle. Never, ever underestimate the prey you thought was helpless. What would you have done if you were standing in Brooke's shoes? Would you have played it safe and taken that rigged plea deal? Or would you have risked everything to fight a completely rotten system? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of cold, unyielding justice hit you right in the chest, make sure to smash that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another story about an underdog who turned the tables on the powerful. Be careful who you laugh at or look down on. You never truly know who's really wearing the cuffs. Thank you for watching, stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next story.